and she couldn't find the link and she didn't know how to register. Okay, so.
What was her name?
Marilyn Kingston.
Yep, she called me yesterday, and I called her back and gave her the information. And when I woke up this morning, then she. Are
you there? Are you still there?
Yep, I am still here. I was just getting this ready to live stream to YouTube because I had some people that just wanted to hop on whenever, so it's being live streamed to YouTube as well.
Do I look yellow to you from this light, or is it just
no, it's tough to get a gauge of what you actually look like when you look at, like when I look at myself in the screen, I look fairly orange. I don't know if it's because of my shirt or if it's because of the light, but on my end, you're coming through just fine.
I shouldn't move this light anymore, or it's okay where it is?
No, you're perfect.
Okay. All right. So you'll just tell me when to begin. I have notes that I'm going to be referring to. I'm going to try not to be reading, but
you're coming through just fine. Okay, I just want to make sure that the YouTube thing is working, so I'm going to have that up on my phone. Okay, I'm going to just get things situated here so that people at home. Okay. So I'm going to start to get this thing ready to go and start letting people on. Okay. And participants. All right, so I'm going to let people on. So wait a few minutes.
Yeah, I show it's 7:20, so people are starting.
Yeah, I told people at 7:15 or so I would let them on. 2 minutes late, that's fine.
Okay. Is any of this paraphernalia on my desk visible, like my water or?
Nope.
No. Okay, that's good.
Hi, everybody. And here's Marilyn Kingston.
Hi, Marilyn.
It's coming on in a minute.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Still got a little bit of time, so we're going to just wait for everybody to come on with the goal of getting started at 7:30.
Let's pray for my battery first.
So interesting to see the name Ruth Klein. That was my aunt.
And I have to say, I went out to a birthday celebration today for a friend of mine named Ruth Klein.
Oh, really? Yeah, there are a lot of Ruth Kleins. I just received an email today from someone whose family member was Klein and who wanted me to give them some information, but there was no relationship. So there are a lot of us.
Okay.
So Marilyn checked in?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, she is here.
Oh, there you are, Marilyn. I see your name, but not your face.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah, I know. It's like a drag. Put on makeup to go to a meeting.
You look great.
Yeah. Thank you for joining.
Go grab something. Wait. Still missing quite a few people. Okay. But he's very quiet today.
Anyway.
All good, Rabbi?
Say that again.
I said all good?
All is good. Long time
All
no
is
see.
good. Yes.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello, Glenn.
Hello.
Got another 3 minutes.
Okay,
And then we'll go ahead and get started.
pardon me? Um, you have the slide, the first slide,
Which one?
number 14.
Number 14.
Yes.
Yep.
So that should be, how does that appear on the,
It'll be, I'll make it really big once you let me know which ones you need. Yeah, I'll do it in slideshow mode so you can see them very clearly.
okay, good.
Yeah, there's just gonna be a lot of moving parts to this, so
Yeah.
we
So
appreciate everyone's patience and cooperation tonight.
there's not that many slides. There's maybe 5 or 6.
Okay.
And I'll just mention the slide number when it's time to change.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Going to go ahead and get started in about a minute. So I just want to ask everyone if you can please make sure that you're on mute so that we can clearly hear tonight's program. You will have an opportunity to unmute later and ask any questions, but for the time being, please make sure that you are on mute. Okay. We're still trickling in a little bit. I'm going to give it another minute or so. Okay.
Just wait, honey. I want to see this, honey. Just wait.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good. Now we just got a couple more people coming in. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, just make sure.
How many people registered?
There's about 40 and we're a little bit over half of that. So I'm sure people will still be trickling, but respect everybody's evening and time. We're going to go ahead and get started. So once again, if you can make sure that you are on mute, we're going to go ahead and get started with tonight's program.
Herzlich zu, wir singen, wie es klappen unsere Herzen, mit Rhythm von euer Leben, herzlich zu. Wir seien euer Kinder, wir singen euer Lieder, zu lieb euch, wir seien da, we are here because of you. We'll tell your story, live your dreams, and sing your song. With courage, faith, and hope, with voices proud and strong. The world will know your life, your love, your legacy lives on. Herzlich zu, we will remember you. You're with us everywhere we go. We hold you safely in our hearts. We'll share with future generations all the lessons of your past, all your suffering and losses, all the pain that you went through will never be forgotten. Herzlich zu. We'll tell your story, live your dreams, and sing your song. With courage, faith, and hope, with voices proud and strong. The world will know your life, your love, your legacy lives on. Herzlich zu, we will remember you. We have cried in all our tears the sadness of your darkest years. But the joy in your survival gives us life. Wir wollen euch keinmal nicht vergessen. Wir wollen euch ständig gedenken. Euch ewig will wir singen zu lieb euch. We'll tell your story, live your dreams, and sing your song. With courage, faith, and hope, with voices proud and strong. The world will know your life, your love, your legacy lives on. Herzlich zu, we will remember you. Herzlich zu, we will remember you.
You're muted.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
okay.
Okay. All right. So good evening, everyone. I want to take this moment to thank you all for joining us tonight as Perrineville Jewish Center hosts our virtual International Holocaust Remembrance Day program. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Inbar Robbins, and I'm the executive director here at PJC. I'm also the granddaughter of an Auschwitz-Bergen-Belsen survivor. Educating our youth, our community, and bringing about programs such as tonight's is my small way to remember her and to live up to the saying, never forget, never again. All right. January 27th is designated by the United Nations General Assembly as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Since 2005, the UN and its member states have held commemoration ceremonies to mark the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of Nazism. The same resolution supports the development of educational programs to remember the Holocaust and to prevent further genocide. The resolution not only establishes January 27th as International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, it also rejects any form of Holocaust denial. The resolution encourages member states of the UN to actively preserve sites that the Nazis used during the final solution, such as killing centers, concentration camps, and prisons. Drawing from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the resolution condemns all forms of religious intolerance, incitement, harassment, or violence against persons or communities based on ethnic origin or religious belief throughout the world. The Holocaust profoundly affected countries in which Nazi crimes were perpetrated, but also had universal implications and consequences in many other parts of the world. Member states share a collective responsibility for addressing the residual trauma, maintaining effective remembrance policies, caring for historic sites, and promoting education, documentation, and research several decades after the genocide. This responsibility entails educating about the causes, consequences, and dynamics of such crimes so as to strengthen the resilience of young people against ideologies of hatred. As genocide and atrocity crimes keep occurring across several regions, and as we are witnessing a global rise in anti-Semitism and hateful discourses, this has never been more relevant. Please focus your attention to this video presented by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C.
Being a sole survivor is a responsibility to tell you what it means to lose everyone.
Not only were my parents killed, but also 3 of my sisters.
First my father and 16-year-old brother, and then my mother and 2 little boys, and then older sister, and then yet another younger sister.
She was 19 months old and just learning to walk, and she was murdered.
32 of my family members, most of them starved to death or gassed to death.
What haunts me is, why did I survive?
Surviving had a purpose, and the purpose was to remember.
This year, International Holocaust Remembrance Day comes at a pivotal moment for our nation and the world. The Holocaust is a harsh reminder of the consequences of unchecked hatred and the fragility of societies. Its lessons have never been more relevant. Today, as we witness an alarming rise in anti-Semitism, racism, and neo-Nazism, we must recommit ourselves to learning those lessons and acting on them. That commitment to shaping the future is precisely what we owe the victims of the past.
I want to remember Tante Anna, the way she was before she was murdered. Her hugs were warm and soft, and holding our hands, she took us into the kitchen where the bobenik was baking and allowed us to help her take it out of the oven. Of course, we received the first piece.
I know that my father loved my mom and me because I have the postcard he sent from forced labor camps. He finished his letters with this sentence: "Millions of kisses to you and my precious Peter from Arpad, who loves you a lot."
My father, he loved to lead prayers, had a beautiful voice. The last time I saw him was when I was 4.5 years old.
I was 9 months old when I was placed in hiding. And it's through those photographs that I came to love my dad and my sisters.
My brother, aside from being adorable, was 1.5 years younger than I was. I remember ice skating with him, holding hands, and we never argued. We were always warm and loving, always.
She was a very strong person, my Aunt Giza. I remember her running with my brother and me, each by one hand, and taking us to our neighbor and saying, "Please take these children," when she herself was being deported. It was a moment that I will never forget.
All those people who were killed during the Holocaust were important. Many of them could have been great scientists, lawyers, chefs, doctors, poets, writers. What a loss to humanity.
Holocaust memory is a reflection of our commitment to advancing our shared humanity. It is a global responsibility. We undertake this sacred task as citizens and leaders, as institutions and nations. From Poland, France, and Germany to the halls of Congress and here on the National Mall, we join together in honoring the victims and educating new generations.
Auschwitz has a very, very diverse history. It was not an extermination camp as at the beginning. During the 2 first years, it was a concentration camp. Many different groups were sent to Auschwitz. January the 27th is the day of the end. This is the very day of the liberation. We are guiding now in 22 languages because more than 60% of our visitors are teenagers. So we cannot propose them to have a deep understanding during the visit in another language that is their first language, of course. We have to think about the future. The remembrance is something that has to be turned to the future and not only to the past, because it creates for us some concrete moral obligations. So we have to deal with some new problem, with some new anti-Semitism in the world, with some new expression of the racism, of xenophobia. And that's why I'm committed to keep this history, this remembrance, this memory, those testimonies, those words for the future.
Our site is located on the headquarters of the Gestapo, later the whole police, the SS, which were combined to the Reich Security main office. So you can say from here there were connections to every crime which was committed in Germany and especially in occupied Europe. Our focus is what were the structures behind the crimes and where were the people who committed these crimes. We have a commitment of the federal government, we have a commitment of all the states governments, we have a commitment of many institutions, schools, universities, industrial complexes involved in the persecution system. And I think it's important to explain our society, this happens, and you can't forget it, you can't deny it. You have to deal with it and you have to learn from it. The hope is, first of all, that we understand the history from the view of the victims, with the eyes of the victims, and we try to learn for us nowadays and also how we should behave in the future to prevent such a crime.
The beginning was in France, and after that, the fate of the Jews in France joined the fate of all the Jews of Europe in a genocide. And the 27th of January is much more a day for education. A lot of children are coming to the memorial, and we are going inside the school. We organize trips to Auschwitz during that month of January and February, when we are in the world of Auschwitz, a real world of Auschwitz, with the survivor. There is something going from the survivor to the children, from the children to the survivor, and at the end of the day, it's something else. The paradox is sometimes we have children that are very moved by the story of the Jews during the war, but they don't make the link between the past and the present. And we have to deal with that to show that the Jews today are the same than the Jews before the war. But you need to educate, and you educate with what? With history of genocide, because you know the genocide didn't start with bullets, with extermination. It started with words.
This Day of Remembrance is so important to honor the victims of the Holocaust, the victims of these atrocities, and to honor our commitment of never again. By remembering, we recommit ourselves to end atrocities globally.
The loss of 6 million people during the Holocaust is very important for us to recognize the tragedy and the travesty that man can sometimes do to one another. It's a story of devastation, but it's also a story of resilience.
And our commitment to put this institution on the National Mall is a statement about the values of America and our gift to mankind. But yet today, as we see Holocaust deniers, yet today, as we see those who believe they can benefit by scapegoating Jews for political reasons, and we must say, no, we're not going to ever let that be used again by anyone.
It's growing in popularity to try to really rewrite history and make this into something that's fictional. It's such a lie that we have to all stand up and having survivors who have been there speak to us while they can. I would tell the younger generation, we can't let people who are our friends or our associates or in our circle, so to speak, say the most disastrous and challenging and racist and xenophobic things and think of that as a normal joke or whatever. It's our responsibility to stand up and be counted on the right side.
As individuals, our first responsibility is to understand history, to make sure that we learn from history and we don't repeat the mistakes of history. In America, diversity is our strength.
We need to make sure that they're as educated as possible on the history of the Holocaust and their responsibility to reject those folks who literally just inflame situations because they don't like the look of a person, the religion of a person, the ethnicity of a person.
One of the best strategies to deal with the rise of hate is for us to recognize that we're all in vulnerable groups. And we need to join together to say that we will not tolerate the type of marginalization that we see in any of our minority communities.
I'm totally convinced that this history is so strong, and if we teach it well, that they ask themselves questions more self-critically, as how could people commit such crimes to other people?
We must integrate knowledge in everything, even in ceremonies, because today we must give knowledge, content, reflection against all the different media that deny or are telling fake news, and etc., etc.
We have to stay very strongly on the side of the values that are coming from this history, the human values, of course.
I'm here today because of what people did. They risked their lives and saved me.
I was born in the middle of the Holocaust in 1942, and I survived the Holocaust by being hidden as a child.
I was a child then, and I saw the discrimination, the hate that was perpetuated.
I was fortunate in escaping arrest on several occasions with the help of some people who did the right thing and who stepped in when they saw an injustice.
Because there are so many stories that have been left untold, and people need to listen to these stories.
They are no longer here, but their history will be preserved. We survivors are proof that it happened.
The Nazis would like to give them numbers. We would like to give them back the names.
I think they would like to be remembered, but they would like to be remembered for the next generations, for our kids and for the kids of our kids, for the future.
I need you to remember because my generation is dying out.
I need you to remember because the Holocaust happened during my lifetime, not in ancient history. The world stood by and did not help.
You need to speak out, educate, and take a stand.
Without your voice, we're in danger of forgetting.
You could be the target of hatred or discrimination, and you would count on someone to speak up on your behalf.
We have to look at each other and regard each other as equal human beings. We cannot be divided.
Do not keep silent.
Humanity has a short memory, and you are the ones who are left now to bear witness.
We are responsible of our future, all of us.
That future is ours to shape. All of us have a responsibility to teach every new generation the lessons of history. It's not enough for people to ask, "What would I have done?" We must challenge them to ask, "What will I do?" Today, we remember Pinchas Galperin, Gittel Grinbaum, Mordecai Moskowitz, Ilona Selfreund, Moses Spiegel.
Shlomo Mutapel, Faye Markman, Avremel Markman, Hindebele Mendel, Aaron Mendel.
Nina
As of today, only 20 out of 50 states mandate Holocaust education in public schools. We at Perrineville Jewish Center are proud of its Lev Academy Jewish Enrichment Program for students ages 8 to 13 and our ongoing commitment to ensure that the next generation understands the past and remembers what so many gave up in the quest to remain dedicated to our heritage and faith. Our goal is to ensure that every student who completes our program has an in-depth understanding of this dark and tragic time in the history of the Jewish people, and to develop a sense of pride and self-confidence in who they are as Jews, both in our local and global community. Only by learning of our past can we understand our present, and only by taking action today can we ensure our future. I'd like now to call upon Rabbi Jacobs to recite the El Malei Rachamim prayer.
Thank you, Inbar. Thank you for organizing such a wonderful program. Thank you to our speaker. I'll do the El Malei Rachamim in English. El Malei Rachamim Shochein B'Meromim. God full of mercy who dwells on high, protector of widows and father for the fatherless, please be not silent and show no restraint on behalf of the Jewish blood that has been spilled like water, but grant perfect rest on the wings of your divine presence. In a lofty abode of the holy, pure, and valiant who shine as the brightness of the heavens to the souls of the brothers and sisters, 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were put to death, slaughtered, burned, starved, buried alive, or who suffered other forms of unnatural death at the hands of the accursed Nazis and their associates. May their name be wiped out. In Auschwitz, Treblinka, Miadnik, Mauthausen, and in other death camps in Europe, and who gave up their lives in order to sanctify God's name, because we are at one with their memory, and we pray for the elevation of their souls. Their resting place shall be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore shall the Master of Mercy care for them under the protection of his wings for all time, and bind their souls in the bond of everlasting life. O earth, do not conceal their blood, and let there be not a resting place for their cry. In their merit shall the remnant of Israel return to its rightful place. And as for the holy ones, their righteousness shall be in front of the Lord as an everlasting memory. They will come in peace and will rest in peace. They will meet their rightful destiny at the end of days. And let us say, Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Glenn. If you have them with you, please join me in lighting your own memorial candles and saying the following prayer. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. We pause to light this candle, a symbol of the human spirit that fought to bring light through the darkness. This light will stand as a permanent marker as we honor their life and memory. The human soul is a light from God. May it be your will that the soul of the 6 million exterminated in the Shoah enjoy eternal life along with the souls of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, and the rest of the righteous that are in Gan Eden. Amen. Finally, I'd like to call upon Rabbi Shavelowitz to say a few words and to lead us in the mourner's Kaddish.
Thank you, Inbar.
A little while ago, I happened to have opened up Messenger, and by chance I saw something from a woman that I had known since high school, and she put up, similar to what we saw before, a picture of her family, and she had mentioned that her mother, all these people that was in the picture passed, except for her mother, who survived Auschwitz. But what got me was the words she said at the end of the caption, that I live Holocaust Remembrance Day every day. And I thought to myself, as I'm going to say this meditation now, that if we could find a space for everyone, every survivor or non-survivor's relative, to say Kaddish for one of the 6 million, how much space would we need? How much room would we need to get everybody together who lost a relative in the Holocaust to say Kaddish for a person at one time? Probably millions. Space for millions. And it's such a deep and travesty that how this has affected people. You know, you never thought who you're speaking to and how or who you knew or who you know and how that affected that person. I'd like to say in meditation, are we going to say Kaddish later? Okay, so I will just read this meditation.
Right after the meditation.
Okay, so we were going to say Kaddish, and to emulate that, if every one of us can think of just someone who you knew, someone who had affected you, someone in your family who didn't survive or survived and is not here now, to think of that person and join us in Kaddish. And if we, just all of us, could do that at one time, we would raise the souls of those unfortunate souls. A meditation. Memory is the ridge that links the living and the dead. When we remember those who are no longer with us, their spirit continues to influence our lives. For that reason, we observe the rituals of mourning, Kaddish, and Yortzeit. The Kaddish is only one prayer in the entire service. However, it brings the meaning of the worship to a climax, proclaiming the majesty of God and assuring us of his continuing care even in our sorrow. And the recognition of God's majesty implies the highest goal of living to which a human being may be summoned. Help us to cherish in loving and abiding memory the good that was in those whom we love and remember. May we honor them in deeds or righteousness. May we be sustained with an unfaltering faith in God's goodness today and for all time. Amen. Please join us in a memorial Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. B'yalma divrach Yerutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah v'varach v'yalam v'omei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kodisha v'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amiran v'yoma v'imru amen. Yehei Shlomo Rabbah min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May all the souls of all the martyrs and all their survivors who are living with these memories. May we all find peace, and may all those who passed on rest in peace.
Thank you, Rabbi. This year marks the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Yet the past continues to haunt, shape, and guide us to this very day. After their liberation, Ruth Klein's parents were brought first to the displaced persons camp in Germany and then sent to the United States. They were traumatized, starving, and impoverished, but they were among the survivors. Once in America, however, their struggles didn't end. In Surviving the Survivors, she shares what it was like to grow up with parents who were permanently damaged by the effects of the war. Full of humor and unfathomable tragedy, this is her story of how ultimately her upbringing gave her a keen appreciation for the value of life and made her, like her parents, a survivor. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Ruth Klein.
Thank you, Inbar. Thank you all for joining me tonight to talk about my memoir, Surviving the Survivors. Tonight, we reflect on the echoing effects of the Nazis' murderous attempt to erase European Jewry. We also think about the survivors, their sufferings, their losses, and the heart-wrenching horrors they witnessed and endured. My memoir was actually, the idea was conceived by my sister, Sarah, during the last weeks of her life, as she was fighting a long battle with cancer. And we spoke about it. She said we had such an unusual childhood. She thought that it would make a compelling story. And she, I think, thought that she would survive and be able to add to the memoir. She did not, and I was grieving for a long time, but I finally resolved to write the memoir. What we do is we reflect on the pain and the trauma that I felt, that she felt in my adult life and our adult lives, on the past, in the 1940s and the 1950s. It changed lives forever, for me and for many others. And it is a critical part of remembering the Holocaust. I mentioned to my close friend Judy Shore that I was planning to write the story of my family. And Judy was trained as an attorney, had a long-time interest in creative writing. And she was intrigued by the idea of a memoir from a second-generation point of view. I asked her if she could help, and a partnership was established. Judy assisted in historical research and helped me format the story, the photographs, into a memoir of family history, which then I finally wrote. Nearly 16 years have elapsed since Sarah's untimely death, and during that time, the intensity and effort on researching, interviewing, selecting photography, writing drafts, rewriting drafts has ebbed and flowed. What emerges is a raw, sometimes tragic story, made of external and internal circumstances of which families and the players sometimes have control, but more often do not. The story tells of aristocratic Polish Jewish merchants and landowners, horrific refugee concentration camps, endless displacement, and unimaginable suffering. Excuse me. This story continues in America, only to have things break down time and time again. Imbar, if you could put up the slide of Siberia.
Siberia slide?
Yes. My mother was born in 1916. She was named Bronislava Marcus. She was born in a town called Sandomierz. This is in the southeast part of Poland, about 40 kilometers from Krakow. She came from a family of great wealth and prominence. Her grandparents, the Seiberts, owned a large expanse of land where they grew hops for the Polish beer that they produced in their brewery. And many of the townspeople worked for her family. She spoke of the beautiful life she had, seeing her grandparents every day, her loving parents and her sisters. She spoke of her younger sister, who tragically was killed. Her grandparents gave a lot of money and jewels to a non-Jewish friend who promised to take her to England into a convent where she could survive out the conflict. But he took the money and the jewels and he turned her over to the Nazis who slaughtered her. I never knew the names of her sisters, but I later found a photograph of her older sister, who was an artist. And on the back it said Rosia. And it was dated 1944. She's a beautiful, beautiful girl, beautiful woman, light hair, fair complexion. And on the back of the picture, it said it was dated 1944. So it's clear she lasted till almost the end of the war. She worked for the Polish underground resistance, and she was caught and then killed. Sadly, while the Germans occupied her town, my mother was in medical school with her husband, Nathan, and they had a 2-year-old son. Usually Jews weren't allowed into medical school, but if you had enough money for a bribe or connections, you could get in. And they were both wanting to be doctors. My mother wanted to be a pediatrician. But when, with the click of a trigger, everything changed in her country. The Germans occupied her hometown, which consisted of about 2,500 Jews. And they were under German occupation. In 1942, all 2,500 and other Jews in nearby small towns were sent by trains to Treblinka and Belzec, where this is where her parents and other family members must have perished. While she was in medical school, all Jews were required to have physical exams. And just by coincidence, the doctor who examined her was her professor. And he marked on her papers that she was Irish Catholic. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. And I don't know if this was an act of kindness or perhaps a rebellion against the Nazis, but he saved her life. And so she and Nathan and their 2-year-old toddler escaped Poland, and they went to the Ukraine, and then they wanted to get as far away from the Germans as they could, so they went further and they ended up in Siberia. They went by different methods, by these trains. She mentioned cattle cars, she mentioned trucks, all kinds of transportation. I'm not sure exactly how, but they did go by free will. And when they got there, they found a little village, which was a hiding place for Jews. And in the photographs I have, I see some soldiers in the background, but at the Holocaust Museum, when I was doing the research, these soldiers were wearing what was identified as Polish uniforms. So there must have been some military presence there, but they were not in forced labor. Tragically, in this time of unspeakable cold, their 2-year-old son died of starvation and cold on the frozen tundra. And then shortly after his death, Nathan, her husband, disappeared. So my mother was left with a baby girl, which she had named Sarah. And they just had to fend for themselves. So my mother had to fend for herself. She did whatever she could to survive. She dug in the snow, pulled out frozen potato roots to make a soup. Any woman who was lactating fed other babies, and so they survived. In the meantime, I'll just tell you my father's story. He was born in 1911 in Warsaw, Poland. He was a wealthy, handsome, capable businessman. His family home was a large mansion on the same street as the Telegraph and Communications building. They owned a country home for weekends and holidays. They had servants to attend all their household needs. His father died in the early 1930s, so my father took over as chairman of the board for a large company which produced felt. And this manufacturing company was making and selling products that were serving international clients. He was responsible, very well respected. He was well educated. He went to university. He spoke 6 languages. He had a knowledge of music, literature, poetry. In addition, he was a very good amateur photographer who chronicled his life with his Leica camera. And even in Siberia, where he found a Russian camera, he took photographs. His father died, as I mentioned, in the early 30s. So he lived with his mother, his brother Joseph, and his sister Genia, who was also a model for Christian Dior in the 1930s. And she was a beautiful woman. Thinking their wealth would protect them somehow, they soon learned the bitter truth. And the Nazis took over their house and used it as their headquarters in Warsaw. And they took away the factory, and they took away all their money, and they placed my father and his family and their servants in the Warsaw Ghetto, where people were, as you know, dying from sickness and hunger and cold. And after the war, my parents were left with the possibility of a new beginning in a new country with one child, Sarah, who survived the war with their Jewish faith and heritage. But the defining characteristic of my parents, their Jewishness, is what caused them to stand stripped of nearly all they knew. And this was profoundly passed on to me. One day, of no particular significance, my father and his brother-in-law left the ghetto to go to the train station to get the mail, which the train stations were a clearinghouse of information. And then rushing back before the curfew, they ran into a man from the ghetto who told them to stop and not return to the ghetto, that there had been a mass killing and that his family was killed in cold blood. For no reason. I think maybe they were made examples of. I'm not sure what the reasons were, but I'll never know. But they were executed. He was married to a wife named Junia, and he had a beautiful baby girl. She was also shot in cold blood. So he was told not to go back to the ghetto because he would encounter the same fate. So he ran east. And he told me the story when I was a little girl, that while he was on the run, he was stopped by 2 German soldiers, and they taunted him, and they started to torture him. They tied his hands behind his back. They were interrogating him, actually, for some information. They thought he might have some Russian connection, not sure what, but they were interrogating him and telling him to hand over his money. So there was a tree stump. They put his head on the tree stump, and they held an axe over his head while they were taunting him. And he had some money bills in his belt, he said. I mean, he had some bills in his money belt. But he said that if he turned him over, he would be good as dead anyway, because he needed the money for bribe or food or somehow to survive. So he just waited his beheading. And then by chance, 2 SS officers came and started questioning these soldiers. And he saw an opportunity to run, and he did. He fled and he went east. In my research, I found some information from an organization called the Victims of the Polish Polish Victims of the war, and this document showed that he was arrested in Belarus. He later was in a Russian prison camp. He was there in horrible conditions for a long time, taken out just for periodical beatings and interrogations, and then put back into these unbearable conditions in the prison camp. And I don't know how he escaped or if he was released, but he then kept going further east, and he ended up in the same little community of survivors who were hiding. And while there, he saw my mother when she was walking down the street carrying all of her bundles, her possessions in a bundle or a bag, and she was carrying her baby daughter. And so he went over and he helped her, and he stayed with her, and they stayed together for the remainder of the war. Sarah was born in 1943, so he was with her from then until the end. And then they followed the Russian troops back to Europe and went back to Poland after the war. And my mother was devastated because everyone that she knew, her whole family, everyone was gone. There was nobody left. And then when they went to Warsaw, the devastation was unbearable. There was nothing left. Warsaw was just bombed terribly, and everything that my father knew and had was gone. So they went to Germany, and they were this was the first displaced persons camp that they lived in. This was a camp that I was born nearby. I was born in a basement of a bombed out church. For my mother, this was a luxury. It was not even a building. It was just wooden pallets laid on a dirt floor, and hundreds of broken, sick people were lying around and needing medical care. The American Red Cross, the International Red Cross, sent help, and I was delivered by a doctor from Philadelphia, which my mother always talked about with great pride, that I was born first in a real building, and then that a doctor came all the way from Philadelphia to help the refugees, the Polish or the European refugees. So I grew up thinking that, well, first I should say there was no such thing as Holocaust education in America when I was growing up. I suppose it was too soon, and too many Americans were either in denial or not comprehending the devastation of the cities, the towns, the concentration camps, the horrific mass extermination, the countless senseless killings, and the giant graves of innocent women and children. The people we encountered and who became our friends were known to others, known to us and others as the Polish refugee families who came from Europe or the Eastern Bloc or the immigrants after the war. We were often referred to as greeners, a word that comes from greenhorns. We grew up believing that we were alone in our misery, dysfunction, and extremely odd family life. But my research showed that we were not alone. It also revealed that this is not necessarily the case for all second-generation children. Some had benign or even beautiful memories of growing up after the 1940s and 50s. I learned that some second generation, like myself, felt they'd been deprived of an unencumbered childhood. They described their childhood as serious, withdrawn, clutched, and monotone, which are all familiar to me. Children of survivors complain about their parents' unavailability, overprotectiveness, and lack of empathy. My mother fit into a category of someone who was unusually sweet, unusually kind, but not 100% emotionally available. And as an adult, I can see why. My father can be described as many Holocaust survivor parents. That is, he was overbearing, intrusive, controlling, inflexible, physically and verbally abusive. Anger had been a big problem for many survivors, more so for males and females. As in my family, the second generation reports the emotional explosions and other irrational behaviors. From the readers of my book, I've received many, many emails and comments saying, Ruth, you've just told the story of my life. And then I've had just a few, maybe 2 or 3, that say their parents were Holocaust victims. They lived through concentration camps, and yet they too, they had beautiful and loving childhoods. They had none of the experiences that I did. So there's quite a range of experiences among the second generation. But feelings of guilt, anger, depression, mistrust of others, and fear are common among the second generation. Some families were different, and they tried to ensure that the children had everything they wanted, and they hovered over them to protect them as though they were, they might be able to protect them from harm. Today we call this approach the helicopter parents. And Holocaust survivors that we knew, there was one family who carried their daughter everywhere she went. Her feet never touched the ground. They treated her like a fragile orchid, even though she was perfectly capable of walking. If there was the slightest wind, her parents wouldn't consider taking her outside. If someone coughed in an auditorium or a theater, they quickly carried her away in their arms. As she grew older, she started defying her parents in every possible way. She began her rebellion by shoplifting and later became a heroin addict. In protecting their daughter from all evil, they failed to protect her from herself. After years of self-destruction, my friend finally turned her life around in adulthood. Some examples of our fears, which are could be called humorous. Sarah and I were afraid of Sarah not as much as me. Sarah was feisty and she had a lot more courage than I did, but we did have a lot of fears. And among them was, even as adults, making a left-hand turn. This was something driving a car in America. I always feared I would get killed if I made that left-hand turn. And the irony is that her daughter became a marine biologist. And she routinely and fearlessly spent hours, days, and weeks in the submarine surveying and studying the bottom of the ocean. So we were in complete awe how this third generation did not have the fears that we were so steeped in. The quirks that I thought were peculiar to my family can be seen in Holocaust survivors. They were usually, I already said they were usually kind and mostly unavailable emotionally. My father can be called, as many Holocaust survivor parents, overbearing, as I said. So this is just a little bit of history about what I learned about second generation in my research. The next slide is of Siberia. We already did the, no.
We did the Siberia one.
We did the Siberia photo. So
Yeah.
The next slide, the next slide would be number 7, number 9. Can those be placed together or?
I can't do them together, but I'll switch between them.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. When my father passed away in 1994, he left me a collection of photos and letters and legal documents. Some dated before Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, and others after in 1945. These possessions, I felt, gave me the permission to search for other records of my family's past and their experiences before, during, and after the Holocaust. I went to the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington. I got documents from the German archives, the American Red Cross, International American Red Cross, Polish archive, several other agencies provided an abundance of documentation and information. At the Holocaust Museum and the library, the archivist helped me find the Seibert Marcus family business, their brewery, their residences, just verifying all the information that I was told. But it was amazing to see the white pages and the business pages and see my family's businesses. Even my father's business was advertised. The International American Red Cross even provided a passenger list of the ship that we sailed on when we came to America. These organizations are amazing if you want to trace your family's history. So after my family arrived in the United States, we ended in Los Angeles, and we were very surprised by the lack of support and interest. Our only relatives, which was my father's Uncle Saul and his wife Aunt Minnie, had for us. They were well established in the United States before the war began, and they were our sponsors. We thought they would help us get settled, find jobs, become respectable Americans, but this was not the case. We learned that Jewish refugees were often disdained by American Jews, and even though they were closely related. My great uncle Saul had 2 grandchildren, and we had a couple of brief encounters, but occasionally they came to our house with a big bag of clothes. And when they left, we enthusiastically looked through these contents of these bags, and we just found moth-eaten sweaters, clothes bleached beyond recognition, socks with holes in them. And then we ultimately just threw them out. And so privately, we called them Uncle Saul and Tante Minnie with the schmatas, Uncle Saul and Aunt Minnie with the rags. This lack of support or even interest in what Holocaust survivors experienced was felt by everyone in our community of Polish Jewish refugees. We lived among several families whose experiences were horrific in Auschwitz, Russia, and other concentration camps and ghettos, but nobody was interested in hearing their stories. It may be possible that some Americans may have believed the dirty Jew propaganda. We felt some of this anti-Semitism, even among Jews. It felt that as though American Jews did not want to associate with what they called greeners, as I said. So our parents and those other second generation kept to themselves. It was years later when people told their stories. Chester Kingston was one of the survivors and a close family friend. She was one of the first people to be interviewed by Steven Spielberg for Shoah. She then became very active and was extremely effective in speaking in public events about the Holocaust all over the country. Through the early 1950s and 60s, the refugee families kept close to each other. At the same time, they were not intrusive. For example, they must have known my family had problems. On several occasions, my mother called upon other families to take Sarah and me away from home because of my father's maniacal behavior. My father never got past the time before the war, where he was a distinguished businessman, chairman of the board of a large manufacturing company, and he dealt with international clients. He was so well respected. He was always traveling abroad, buying his clothes in London or Paris, buying his hats in Borsellino in Italy. He was a perfectly normal person and highly respected, but the tortures of the prison camp and all of his losses of loved ones, family and friends, his loss of hearing, which may have been rendered or induced by the years in the prison or just the war years, turned him into another type of man. He was, by the time I remembered him, he was deaf. He could not find work, although he was fluent in 6 languages. He needed to learn English without being able to hear. So this was very difficult for him. Finally, he found work in a meatpacking house, and he was degraded even more by being demoted to work the night shift because he could not get along with other workers. So he went from being the self-proclaimed Prince of Poland, which is what he called himself frequently, to working in a meat locker. This had enormous consequences when raising a family and struggling to fit into a new country. My father worked nights, so he picked me up from school every day to be sure that I was not late. I dreaded seeing his car. I longed to be like the other children who went to other houses to play after school. This was something I never was allowed to do. And as a child, I just really didn't comprehend why he was so protective. There were some humorous times. My father was so loud and screamed so much at home all the time that I think the neighbors just accepted that that's how he was. And one day at Thanksgiving, my mother was cleaning the stove before she put the turkey in, and she moved it a little too far, and some gas escaped and fire started, and she did the absolute wrong thing. She threw water on it. And so she went running into her room to get her nursing license and some documents. And my father ran out on the front porch in his boxer shorts, and he was just screaming at the top of his lungs, "Neighbors, fire, neighbors, fire, neighbors, fire." Nobody paid any attention. They just thought this was just another normal day in our house. Sarah and I had a lot of responsibility at home, but my father called on me to prepare his dinners before he went to his job. This was usually around midnight, so if I had fallen asleep, he would hit me to wake me up. I would cook his meal of steak, potatoes, and then I would be reprimanded for not having enough water covering the potatoes. It had to be just at a certain level, vegetables and soup. And then finally I would go to bed, and then he would scream out that he wanted another spoon. And although he was within reach, hand's reach of the utensil drawer from where he was seated at the table, he would still shout at me, wake me up to bring him another spoon. I think he was so accustomed to being waited on by servants, and he could not make this transition. I have memories of my father constantly fighting with my mother. Often these fights were about jealousy of the doctors that she dealt with at work. She became a nurse because she could not become the pediatrician she dreamed of. She went to nursing school, and she got a job in a ketchup factory while she was at school. Kitchen table was always covered with chemistry books, English books. She had to learn English while she was in school getting her license. But he was so jealous of all the other doctors, and he even accused her when she bought groceries that she was trying to poison him. He was really mentally ill as a result of his war experiences. And this had a huge impact on his children, the acts that he committed. One day when my mother was at work, I went into the twins' room to get them ready for their bath. I was 9 years old, and I picked up my 2-year-old sister, but I couldn't find her twin brother. So I went to the door of my parents' bedroom. It was shut. So I went in, smelled the gas coming out of the 1950s style heater, and found my brother. He was lying side by side with my father. There was gas coming out of the heaters. They had plastic bags over their heads. And I was horrified. I grabbed my brother, I tore off the bags, I picked up both the babies, and I took them next door to call the police. This wasn't the first time I had called the police because of my father's insane acts. And once again, he was taken away to a psychiatric unit of a hospital by ambulance. The same year the twins were born, my Uncle Joseph and my Aunt Roselle came to America. You could put slide number 34, would be helpful, thank you. This was a time of exhilaration for my parents. An actual family member and his wife-to-be were arriving from Germany and planned to live with us until they got jobs and a place of their own. My uncle, before the war, was enjoying a playboy type of life, and although he went to university and he did go to medical school, but that was ended by the war. He ended up in Bergen-Belsen and was afterwards sent to a sanatorium for tuberculosis. After recovering, he went to Germany where he met Roselle. The worst thing about her was that she had been married to an SS officer and had displayed a photograph of him with his swastika in our family den where they lived. How my parents put up with this, I'll never know, but my mother was especially kind to her since her homesickness was very evident. The mystery was his letters that I had translated, which spoke of great love my uncle had for my father. It was as though he was kissing every hair on his head. They spoke of the experiences and the possibility of reuniting, but when they were finally together, they fought constantly until my father's death. Joseph did not have the mental issues that my father had. He was rational and he treated us children with great kindness and fondness. But one day my father came home to find him in our house talking to my mother. My father went into a rage immediately, accusing my uncle of having an affair with my mother. He grabbed a butcher knife and he was threatening my uncle with it. My mother stepped in between the two of them to intervene. I saw the whole thing from the dining room. I ran to the bedroom once again, called the police. This time he was taken away in a straitjacket and was hospitalized. Again, the shock treatment. He begged to be released, but my mother refused to speak to him. He kept calling and calling the house, so I spoke to him, and I finally took the bus to the hospital to see him. He pleaded with me to get my mother to sign for his release, but finally my uncle signed for him, saying he would take responsibility. But he just dropped him off at our house, and he was home again for another round of abuse. The trauma inflicted on my father during the Holocaust was the cause of this violent behavior, obviously, and landed him in mental institutions where he underwent electric shock treatment multiple times. In those days, PTSD was undefined, and it went untreated. Psychiatry in the 1950s was very primitive by today's standards. There was very few medications available, and it was considered a sign of weakness to get help, so he never did. No one from our community knew the extent of the damage and the trauma associated with my father. They thought he was peculiar because he had a very charming side to him. And they thought he was peculiar, but they enjoyed his company, and he was always included in all the social events. He really could be charming. But when my parents finally divorced, he became estranged to me. I stopped seeing him out of fear that he might harm my mother. I was told by a close family friend that a father is a father. You must be with him. No one understood the kind of father he was and what difficulties the situation presented. If you could put up slide 49. When I was 14 years old, my mother had to work on Passover. She always the dutiful nurse. Sarah was away at college, and I was to prepare the Seder. My mother instructed me on how to make the matzo balls just right, not too hard, not too mushy. And so I arranged the Seder plate and cooked all the food. I put the best tablecloth, put on our best tablecloth and our best dinnerware, laid out perfectly everything in the correct order. My aristocratic father taught us at an early age where and how silverware was to be placed and properly used. When my aunt and uncle arrived and the Seder was to begin, my father took notice that my 7-year-old brother Fred was not wearing anything on his head. My father went to his room and he brought back a Panama hat since he had no extra yarmulkes, the traditional head covering for males. And he told my brother to wear it. Well, Fred refused repeatedly. So my father pulled off his belt and started beating him relentlessly. Freddie was crimson with welts. He was rocking back and forth on the chair, crying and screaming. Over the noise of the screaming, my aunt and uncle called out to my father to stop it and begged him to stop. And they called him an animal. which in Polish, I think, is the worst insult you can give a person. My poor brother just rocking back and forth. And finally, my aunt and uncle left the house because my father wouldn't stop. And then when they left the house, my father was furious. So he left the house. But before he did, he took the tablecloth and he just swished it off the table. And all the food that I had prepared, the brisket, the matzo ball soup, the plate, everything just crashed to the floor. He left the house and I cleaned up the mess. When my mother came home from work around midnight, I told her the whole story while we sat and drank tea and cinnamon toast, which was her favorite late night snack. It was kind of a ritual for us when she came home from work. She said, he's a hypocrite. And the irony of us eating leavened bread on a night when Fred was punished so severely for not covering his head will stay with me forever. We were supposed to have been celebrating our blessings as a family because as Jews, we were finally free from oppression. Hardly. Our family, I realized, was never going to be normal, no matter how hard I tried, no matter how hard we tried. When I was entering high school, he made unreasonable household rules, such as putting a lock on the telephone so he could control who could communicate with us from the outside world. Another rule was we couldn't close the bathroom door. And for a young girl like myself, it was a big nuisance. I had to hold it at home and use the school bathrooms during the day. My first year in high school, we had moved to a different apartment and my mother slept in my room. Sarah was living away at college at this time at UC Berkeley. As a fact, my mother always slept in my room on the nights that my father was home. My father adopted the technique or a tactic that he was used in the prison, I think, which was switching the lights on and off quickly all night long to prevent us from sleeping. On this one particular night when he was doing this, my mother called a survivor family friend, Sam Jackson, in the middle of the night. And within 30 minutes, he and his daughter, Bella, picked me up in their car and drove me to their home. I lived with this family for the rest of the school semester and part of the summer. They just took me in, asked no questions. I shared Bella, who was my best friend. I shared her bedroom. They had all my meals and treats there, and we just enjoyed our other neighbors, the Kingstons, who were also part of this group of Polish refugees that lived right next door to the Jacksons. I guess if you could put up the photo of Genia, you have that one? It was the photograph that I sent. The woman standing in a garden. Did you see that? Yeah. So I learned at a young age, around 5 years old, from some stories that my parents told me about their family members who were killed. Their grandparents, their parents, their siblings, friends, their servants. I was very young when my father told me about how his family died in a bunker. Some of his family died in a bunker. It was years later that I learned about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the people who hid in these bunkers, and they had provisions to last them until they would be safe. My Aunt Genia, who's photographed here, was my father's sister, the one that was the model for Christian Dior. She was a young woman, and along with 84 persons, in-laws, my uncle was married to a woman named Eva, their in-laws, their friends, all the servants. There were 84 people that were hiding in this bunker. And in a letter that he wrote to my father in 1943, he said, owing to my acquaintances, he was kind of a wheeler dealer kind of person anyway, but Owing to my acquaintances, I managed to protect my family against displacement, and I can even say that they are snug as a bug in a rug. We went to Mila Street and we built a bunker under the debris. On April 19th, 1943, 84 persons hid in this bunker, which had provisions of food and everything needed for a long period of time. I, together with 9 men, stood on the ground, and we were officially deported as the last Jews. There are several other letters describing the arrest and internment, and he was finally sent to Bergen-Belsen, his time there. I have so many letters and just not enough time to read them, but they're a real piece of history. Soon after our arrival in Los Angeles, in City Terrace, my mother gave birth to a baby boy. My father was over the moon with excitement, and he took Sarah and I to the sidewalk underneath the window where my mother stood in the hospital room. The baby's name was Simon, named after my paternal grandfather, Simon. We were so happy and delighted and just thrilled with anticipation of our mother coming home with a new infant. But tragically, the baby died, a crib death. In those days, they called it blue baby. My mother's grief was so great. She laid in bed for days, only to occasionally walk to the bathroom, and I could see her in a green and white polka dot long silk robe, her blonde hair trailing behind her, unshoveled. Sarah and I did not know what to think. The Jewish Welfare Service came to our apartment to bring golden books about Moses and one doll. Sarah and I fought over this doll relentlessly. It was the only one we had. They also sent a cook, a housekeeper to help out, and my father spent his days seeking employment. How my mother withstood so much loss is incredible to me. This was the third lost child. While she was in Siberia, she had another child, and this infant was taken away from her. She never told me the details of how this happened, but to have lost 3 children, one stolen, it just is heart-wrenching to me. It just leaves me with intense heartache whenever I think of it. You could put the slide number 70 on, if you don't mind. Eventually, she found work in a ketchup factory with my mother. And while she was attending nursing school during the day. And she remained a nurse for her whole life. Even after she retired, she kept up her license so that she could fill in the charts and hand out carnations to the patients as a volunteer. She was just a devoted nurse. The only thing she really cared about was her job. I mean, she loved her children, but the home was so chaotic that to her it was, her job was everything. And she loved helping people. That's what she just really cared about. When asked her religion, she would just say humanity. I mean, she had lost so much, she'd even lost her faith. She just wanted to help people. The birthday party slide, number 26. In our Polish community, refugee community, I call it our crowd. I have a few memories of being happy as a child. And there must have been more, but there's only a few that come to mind. Aside from my piano lessons, my father bought a piano when we first moved to Los Angeles. He couldn't afford it. We didn't have pillowcases. We didn't have furniture. We had nothing. But he went out and I guess he got a loan. I don't know how, but he bought a brand new piano. And I think it was to replace the piano that he had in his home in Warsaw. They had a piano at their house and they had a piano in their country house where they entertained on the weekends. They had lavish parties, entertainment, even an orchestra would come. So this piano, I think, was a replacement for that, but it came with a a plaque that said, "With love to Sarah and Ruth from mother and father." So we took piano lessons from a teacher, from a lady upstairs. Both Sarah and I were able to copy what she played. And for 25 cents each, she gave us piano lessons. These are my happy memories, these piano lessons, our teacher taking us to the opera to see Hansel and Gretel. I used to walk around in circles reciting the Pledge of Allegiance while waiting for Sarah to come home from school. These stand out as the most happy occasions. Another was on my 14th birthday when my mother and sister planned a surprise party, and all our friends from the old community, the survivor community, came. And my father gave me a Singer sewing machine. So I learned how to sew in junior high. And now I was able to make all my own clothes, which was really a thrill for me to have a wardrobe. I was not sure why, but I knew my family was different in almost every way from all the others in our refugee community. The acts of violence were so disturbing to me, and the boredom of being confined to home because my father mistrusted all outsiders. Neither my sister and I could ever invite a friend over to our house. I was in a state of depression. His behavior was so unpredictable. It just left me in a depressed state. I recall being 8 years old and wishing that I could be someone else in some other place, dreading the tasks that were imposed upon me as a child. When I was in 3rd grade, my teacher, Mr. McCormick, called my mother to have a parent conference about me. When she arrived, she asked, "Is everything all right with Ruthie's behavior? Is she having problems at school?" And Mr. McCormick said, "No, her work is fine. She's a good student, but I see that she's a very morose child. And I was hoping you could give me some insight to this matter. Perhaps it would help." My mother, who didn't know the meaning of the word morose, stayed calm and thanked him for caring about me. And then when she returned home, she told Sarah about the conversation, and Sarah explained the word morose to her, and they had a chuckle over her misunderstanding or the miscommunication. Another exception was when my mother was pregnant with the twins in 1954. She was so beautiful, and she spent a little bit of time with me, a little bit of more time with me. We'd sit on the lawn under the beautiful trees and among the flowers, typical of Southern California. I thought she really did love me, and for once I was happy. And for once I thought she was happy herself. She gave birth to twins on September 30th, 1954. I was 7 years old at the time. Sarah and I were thrilled at having a baby brother and sister. But it wasn't long before my mother had to return to work, and so she left me in charge of caring for the twins. And Sarah and I had both a lot of extra responsibilities while she went back to her routine of nursing, sometimes double shifts because we needed the money. My father worked nights, so as I said, he picked me up from school every day. I was saddened that I couldn't enjoy the other things that normal school kids enjoyed. I'm just searching for my next thought because I just wanted to talk about the mystery that was in the letters of my uncle, the ones I had translated, the way they spoke of their experience and the possible reuniting, but when they were together, how they finally just fought constantly. This went on until my father's death. Inbar, did we do slide 26 already? I think we did.
Yes.
Yes, we did. Okay. And so I just want to end up by saying that, well, one other incident that I think is important that describes my father's inability to control himself. My sister came home from a date in high school, And the boy came onto the porch, and my father opened the door and saw him, and he was non-Jewish. So my father pulled my sister into the house, and he slammed the door. And whether he had a fork in his hand or if he went to retrieve one, I don't know, but he threw a fork with such force, and it landed in the back of, and stuck in the back of my sister's neck. And she had to be taken to the hospital for a tetanus shot. So it's obvious why we never had friends over to the house. I think my mother was a mystery to me. My father was obviously very ill. Sarah was very smart, and she knew her ticket out was education. And she graduated from high school as valedictorian. I'm looking for the slide for Sarah. That's why it's right here. If it's, you could put up slide number 58. So Sarah represented what could be accomplished in America. Every person in a refugee community shed tears as they listened to her valedictorian. It was no surprise to anyone when during her senior year of high school, Sarah was accepted to the University of California, Berkeley. College would provide the means to the freedom she craved. She knew her ticket out was education, and she well deserved the trophies and the many other exceptional prizes she earned. She received a partial scholarship, took out loans, and when she left, I missed her so much. But when I was in high school, I wanted to defy my father, and my mother sensed this. And so she came into my room one night and she said, "Ruthie, it's time for you to leave. It's just too dangerous for you to stay home." So the next morning, she handed me a box with my clothing packed in it. Didn't have a suitcase, and a bag with a cooked chicken and a $10 bill, and took me to the Greyhound bus station. And I took a bus to Berkeley, and I moved in with my sister, who was living in an apartment with a roommate. She was very busy with school. She had student loans, and she was on financial aid, and she worked 2 jobs. So I never really did see very much of her, but I was a huge responsibility for her. She was my legal guardian. She had to enroll me in high school, and she had these responsibilities that really weren't met for a college student like herself. But she was very caring. After living in Berkeley for so long, I couldn't see myself living at home again, and so I went back. I found a job as keeping house for a woman she was a woman who was the first woman to graduate from the School of Architecture at Berkeley. And she had a large house where she had boarders, and I cleaned the house and I cooked the meals for her boarders. And her daughter was a student at Antioch. When she came home, I served her as well. Once my mother came to visit me, and she just broke down in tears because she saw me working as a maid. But the truth was I was doing the same things, but not getting hit for it. And I wasn't being abused. I was very happy. She loaned me her daughter's bike. I rode to school. I went to Berkeley High School, and I rode my bike to school. She lived in the most beautiful area of Berkeley, on a grove of trees on the Alameda Boulevard. Then I stayed in the Bay Area. I later became a piano teacher. But before I talk about that, I'd like to show slide number 89. While I was researching my book, rather having the letters translated, I saw And it was an unexpected development. There was a letter from a man named Svi Denai, and it was from Tel Aviv, Israel. And it was all in Polish. And when it was translated, it was talking about celebrating Passover and making it a ritual and all of this. And to me, I thought maybe this was the brother-in-law that my father was with on that day at the train station, and that maybe he immigrated to Israel, because I couldn't think of anybody in Israel that he knew. So I sent her I sent her a letter, and I explained to her, you know, about the relationship between my father and if they were related. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call back from the social worker, and she didn't understand how I got the address, and she wanted to know. So I actually sent her we sent each other photographs. I had photographs of her with my mother holding me as a baby in Stuttgart. I had photographs of her with my father standing by a car. I had this photograph of her with my uncle after the war. I think they went to Brussels to visit him. And so I'm not sure exactly where this picture was taken. But clearly it was in 1947. So I started this relationship with her. We finally, after several phone calls and communications with the social worker, was finally realized that I was her second cousin, that her father was my grandfather's brother. So we shared the same grandparents. And she and her sister, her older sister, they were both close to my uncle's age. And they spent many, many weekends and vacations, holidays at the country house and in their home in Warsaw, because they were students in Warsaw, or her sister was a student in Warsaw. So they spent a lot of time with him. And I was able to ask her a lot of questions about his family life. For example, did they have a piano? And she said, of course they had a piano. They had a beautiful grand piano. And she spoke of him as though he was perfectly normal, that there was never anything in his life before the war that indicated that he had mental problems. So to me, this was a huge relief. I didn't know that his problems were just, genetic or inherited or cultural. And he was the man that he became because of what he endured, the tortures, the Holocaust, and everything that he had to endure. So her name was Panina. I found her because there were just 6 people listed in the Tel Aviv white pages with that last name, and I picked the first Polish-sounding name, and that was her. And we kept in touch every week. And then finally, this was in 2009, my husband and I went to Israel, and we visited her, and then we went at least once or twice a year. And then eventually we lived there. We lived in Tel Aviv, and I saw her several times a week. We spent every Shabbat together until she died. And she was 94 when she died. So it was a really big thrill for me and for her. Our meeting was very, very touching. When I got off the elevator and she saw me in her apartment building, she just looked at me and she said, "Die Augen." She recognized my father's eyes, I guess, and my family's eyes. And I just feel really so lucky to have met her. I learned a lot from her. She had ways about dealing with life that really taught me lessons. So I'll just end by saying that beyond my feelings for Judaism, the most treasured offering my deeply scarred parents left to me was the gift of music. I had a new piano and with a plaque that read, "To Sarah and Ruth with love for mother and father." I will always play the piano. Perhaps that plaque explains why. Although Bronya and Mietek Friedland were too crippled by the past to live as responsible parents for 4 needy offspring, they were my mother and father. They gave me Sarah first, then Freddie and Gazelle. And despite their own pain and their own warped and wounded ways, they gave me life. And buried somewhere within that ravaged gift of life, they gave me love. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That's for anybody that hasn't read the story, I truly encourage you to go out and pick up a copy. It's available on Amazon. For anybody who wants to read it, it was truly a very well done memoir, full of some of the highlights and a lot of the lowlights that Ruth had mentioned. It was actually incredibly difficult to read at some parts, but it was incredibly well done and really speaks to the trauma that survivors' children and generations thereafter are still experiencing after the Holocaust. So the purpose of International Holocaust Remembrance Day is twofold. First, it serves as a date for official commemoration of the victims of the Nazi regime and to promote Holocaust education. And I am pleased to be making a donation to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Ruth's honor, and it's our deepest gratitude for sharing her story this evening. If anybody has any questions or anything that they want to say or add, feel free to unmute yourselves and we will open up the floor. Oh, everybody's really quiet tonight.
Maybe they all went home.
Tired.
Yeah. Long night.
Long night.
Yeah.
So what song gets you by? Or is there like one favorite song that you always think of that just gets you through the day or gets you through?
Sorry, that's my husband.
Hi, I'm husband. I'm Rich. Nice to meet you.
No, thank you. And my music. Well, one of the things that my father used to say when he was getting ready, getting hungry, he would say, Chopin is playing in my stomach. And I always remember that as a child. And I always feel that Chopin is in my soul. I can't imagine a world without Chopin. So there aren't many works of his that I don't like, and I play many of them. I love classical music. It was a great gift that they gave me. They knew that my mother said, people can take away your house, they can take away your clothes, they can take away your money, but they can't take away your music.
Completely agree.
She supported me. They supported me with my studies, and they couldn't afford the lessons. They always chose the best piano teachers they could find, and it was just amazing.
Yeah, I happen to agree with that. I mean, as I had mentioned, my grandmother was an Auschwitz survivor, and education was first and foremost. And anything and everything that would give you a leg up in life, all of a sudden, it wasn't a stretch to find a way to make it happen. I was sent to private school as a kid, even though we didn't have the money for it. My grandmother used her Holocaust status to work with the executive director to get me a scholarship, and they managed to make it work. Dance lessons. I also took piano lessons when I was a kid. It was, I think, their small way of trying to make up for so much that was lost. And I know that both my mother and I really benefited from a lot of what they were able to give us. So, I happen to have a pretty happy childhood, considering growing up in a house with a survivor, grandmother. But there is still a lot of psychological damage that now, as an adult, I can look back and see. And I think some of it still stays with me, and especially with my mother to this day. So, yeah.
Anyone else? Sacrifices.
Yeah.
A lot of sacrifices.
Yeah.
In spite of the damage, I mean, it's uncontrollable.
Yeah.
I me just get back on here. My grandparents came from Ruth, I think a place, it might have even been the place where your parents came from in Poland. For some uncanny reason, my grandfather and grandmother were going to go back to Poland before 1930, just around 1933, and before getting on the boat, by some miracle, someone said to them, "Don't go on that boat back to Poland because you'll never come back. Hitler's coming and he's going to do something to the Jews," so my grandparents remained here in the United States, and interestingly enough, lost everybody. My grandfather's side, I believe, except for one cousin, which we found, or one nephew, which he found by accident. We found by accident after the war, who survived the Holocaust. I don't remember as a child, and I was able to have my grandparents until through my pretty much my teenage years, ever once talking about what happened to their family in Europe, or even showing it, I think, emotionally or in any way. And so I think there's a story sometimes maybe in bar, if you would get someone who actually was in the similar situation where they grew up, they came to the United States and they left their families in Europe, their whole families perished and they remained here, how their lives were, and I'm sure they experienced so much guilt, but they never once spoke about it. Never once, to myself, to my siblings, to the other grandchildren that they had, they never once mentioned anything about what they were feeling about losing everybody, being able to stay in the United States and have left their entire family in Poland to perish. And so interestingly enough, I'm listening to your story here, all right, and what you went through, but we felt it the other way. It was they somehow or another had an emotional detachment. And I'm not the only one that said this. I've spoken to a few other people that told me the same thing, that they left early to come to the United States and they were going to go back to Europe, and the families remained in Europe and they perished, and they stayed here, and never anything was ever mentioned. So that's a story in itself.
It is, but do you think that's part of survivor guilt? That a lot of
I think that, yeah. I just think that either they felt fortunate or they felt guilty that they survived and they left, because they were going to go back. They were just about, my grandfather, for what I understand, had come to New York to probably make some money, unfortunately wound up in the Depression in the United States, the outset of it in the early 30s, and decided at that point that it's got to be a lot better in Poland, Krakow, Poland area, than it was in the United States in 1931, 32. Just about got on the boat almost, and was turned back, was told not to get on the boat by everybody from the captain of the boat to just took the bags and went back to Brooklyn, New York, and that was it. And just never went back and never saw anybody again. So, but again, I think the interesting part is your family, people that I hear such as things who are telling me, people from your family acted out. And my career as a rabbi over the years, I've met many Holocaust survivors and their families as well. And I've heard similar stories in private from very similar to what you've mentioned, that you spoke about here tonight. But when it came to people that just left early and wanted to go back to Europe but never could go back to Europe, they just completely shut down, because I don't think they realized the implication of what your parents went through. They didn't experience it. They know that they lost everybody because of it, but they didn't personally experience it. So it was a different kind of guilt, different kind of reaction.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of not even being able to comprehend what that is. I mean, even for, those of us who grew up with them, I still can't wrap my head around any of it, and reading my grandmother's story just is mind-boggling. I mean, she had part of her father's family move to the United States after World War I. So they had family here. They had somebody that could sponsor them and get them out of Yugoslavia and bring them here. And it obviously just, it didn't happen, but the family here had a very, very different take on what it was like to go through the Holocaust in Europe versus being here in the United States and watching it unfold.
Hi.
I didn't know.
Hey, Linda.
Hi. I just finished helping my 13-year-old grandson who just had his bar mitzvah. He had to do a book report with all kinds of interesting questions and everything on the boy in the striped pajamas.
Oh.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that he had an introduction to, you know, to all the loss, and it's so hard to even comprehend that man could do this to man. And he and I talked about all of that, and I'm so glad you wrote your book, because every book counts, and as a remembrance, and this happened.
Well, I think that Holocaust education is so important, and I have so much admiration for the educators. I met them through my book, and they're always searching for ways to teach children of all ages, and they're so creative and so dedicated to teaching this. I think it's just very admirable.
Yes, and amazing that people could go through this and come out the other side.
Yeah, it is amazing, no matter, yeah.
And then when he told me about the end of the book, because I hadn't read it. And oh God, everybody should read it.
Yeah.
Everybody should get a really, really good background education. I know Ian was very, very involved in our conversations last year during class. We just started our Holocaust unit with this year's class, and the kids they gravitate toward it. It's almost like it's somehow encoded in your DNA, whether your family went through it or not, that there is this desire to know and learn more, because it's just such an impossible thing to be able to comprehend. The level of evil that can exist in the world is it's unreal. And I have to give so much credit to these kids, because they do such an amazing job with the program, and they leave with the knowledge base that they need to go out into the world and handle whatever comes their way in high school and now on college campuses. And this crazy world that we live in, it doesn't seem to be getting any easier, but I always believe that knowledge is power. And the more we can arm them with the truth and with history, the way it really unfolded, the better off they're going to be. So,
Yeah. And I would also like to tell her that I could feel the honesty in everything that she said, that she wasn't afraid to tell her story.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anyone else? That it? Okay, I know it's late. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Ruth, thank you so much for sharing your family story. I know it was probably not an easy tale to write. It was definitely not an easy one to read. But again, I encourage anybody who hasn't read it to go pick up a copy of the book. Again, it's available on Amazon, Surviving the Survivors. It's not super long, but it's chock full of information that will make you laugh. It'll make you cry.
There's also an audible version for people.
Oh, an audiobook as well. So, yeah. So thank you all so very much. I look forward to seeing everybody again in April for our Yom HaShoah commemoration program, where we already have our speaker lined up, and it's going to be a slightly different than what we've done in the past, but I'm sure a story that is going to be very worthwhile and very interesting to hear about as we take on a different topic and we learn a little bit more about those who decided to fight back. And this is the story of one person whose parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as well as in the partisan movement. So that will be on April 28th, 2022. Location to be decided. We'll have to see where we stand with COVID at that time. But again, it will always be Zoom for anybody who needs to watch it on Zoom. So I wish you all a very good night. Stay healthy.
Thank you again.
Stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see everybody soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.